Well, has the much vaunted spring offensive from the Ukrainian side come to a screeching halt now that the calendar has turned into summer? Well, that's what we heard yesterday from Russian President Vladimir Putin, who says the signs are that the strategic reserves from Ukraine have been depleted and that their counteroffensive has come to a grinding halt. So, what does this mean? Take a listen.
Мужики наколотили 245 танков противника и примерно 678 бронемашин разного типа. И, судя по всему, противник занимается тем, что сейчас комбинирует из бригад, которые понесли серьезные потери, новые подразделения, занимается восстановлением боеспособности, но, конечно, опасается таких же масштабных потерь в будущем, потому что это может привести не только к утрате боеспособности.
Meanwhile, European leaders continue to shovel more money and more weapons into Ukraine. We heard this from UK, we heard this from Ursula von der Leyen, and we also heard it from the United States side. More money, more weapons to Ukraine, because sending more money and weapons to Ukraine means that you are defending democracy when you support Ukraine. Our next guest is Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector, former U.S. Marine, who's just written a piece in Consortium News about this nuclear threat and where we are headed potentially to potentially nuclear war. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to unpack all of these things. I first want to touch on your most recent piece, which we heard from President Biden over the past 48 hours on a fundraising trip, by the way, that he's been warning us, of course, about Vladimir Putin, saying he thinks that there's a real possibility that Putin's going to use nuclear weapons. And meanwhile, the other side, on the Russian side, seems to be saying the exact opposite. So you've written this new piece on that specific question on nuclear war. Can you unpack that? Explain to us what your piece is about and where we're headed in this mess right now.
Well, I think we need to understand, first of all, that we live in a world where there's two competing nuclear doctrines. One is the American nuclear doctrine, which Biden has inherited from Trump, who inherited it from Obama, who inherited it from Bush. And this is a doctrine that embraces the notion of preemptive nuclear war, a winnable nuclear war, a world where the United States can envision using nuclear weapons preemptively in an effort to escalate, to de-escalate. That is, showing the other side that we're serious about this and that causing them to back down. And we have to keep in mind that the doctrine that exists under Biden is the doctrine that was in place when a senior Trump administration defense official said, our goal in having this doctrine, and this is a direct quote, our goal is to ensure that every morning when the Russians and Chinese wake up, they don't know whether or not we're going to nuke them. That's the American nuclear strategy. I want people to understand. Let that sink in. And that's the Biden strategy. This is the strategy that Tony Blinken has behind him as he goes forth and does his aggressive policies. The strategy that Jake Sullivan is backed up with when he makes his aggressive policies. And it's the strategy that should be bouncing around inside the muddled brain of Joe Biden when he says ridiculous things such as, I've been warning everybody about Putin. I've been warning them that, the threat of nuclear war is real. No, the only threat of nuclear war comes from the United States, and people should understand that. The only threat of nuclear war comes from the United States. What Russia has said is that they have no intention of using nuclear weapons, tactical or otherwise, unless their nuclear doctrine is triggered. And that one is, of course, if the existential survival of Russia is put at risk, then Russia will use all means available to ensure the continued survival of Russia. That's sort of common sense. I mean, that's why you would have nuclear weapons to begin with, to ensure your continued survival. So, we're in a situation now where we have the United States. Jake Sullivan just gave a presentation at the Arms Control Association earlier this month, talking about the conditions under which America would pursue arms control with the Russians, totally unrealistic expectations. And Putin gave an interesting response because, as Putin is wont to do every now and then, he throws in sort of man on the street, salt of the earth colloquialisms, and he did at this time. He said, now they want to talk about disarmament. They want to come in and look at our strategic nuclear deterrence system at a time when the goal of the United States is to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia.
Right.
And then he used the term "chrenim," loosely translates into pound sand. Now there's a more crude version of that, but and the crowd loved it. But that's the Russian approach right now. The heck with you.
Right. We're going to come
Yeah.
in. We're going to restart. We're going to come in and investigate your nuclear stockpiles as we continue to funnel billions of dollars in weapons into Ukraine to attack on pre-war Russian land.
And this brings us up to the comments you made earlier about van der Leyen and the Europeans talking about supporting Ukraine to the bitter end. Understand that Ukraine's strategic vision is that victory is defined by the return of Zaporizhia, Kherson, Lugansk, Donetsk, and Crimea, basically the pre-1991 borders. They have to be returned to Ukraine. But Russia has absorbed these territories. Constitutionally, they're part of Russia, which means any effort to do this represents an existential threat to the survival of Russia, just like stripping California away from the United States would represent an existential threat to the United States. And so what we're saying is we support Ukraine's effort to guarantee a Russian nuclear response that brings about an end to the world. That's what this is about. And this, again, is coupled with just the sick notion. I mean, Ukraine keeps saying we want to be a member of NATO. But Ukraine has to understand that the United States and NATO is operating under a George Soros-driven notion that speaks of the need to have an Eastern European manpower pool that will be married to NATO technology to threaten Russia. If you understand what I just said, Ukraine will never be part of NATO because they are simply the meat that will be attached to NATO technology to weaken Russia. So our grand strategy of using Ukraine to weaken Russia, combined with Ukraine's sick fantasy of somehow gaining control over these former territories, all lead to triggering Russia's nuclear response. We're committing suicide as we speak, and people need to wake up and understand this, that the policies that the United States and NATO are pursuing right now are policies guaranteed to result in a Russian use of nuclear weapons. And now a Russian strategic theorist, a historian and academic, Sergei Karaganov, has just written an important piece. And what's important about this is that his opinions are listened to, and they are reflective of mainstream thinking in Russia. And he said it's time for Russia to change its nuclear posture into adapting its own preemptive policy. And it's time, if NATO and the United States continues to pursue these policies, that Russia preemptively uses a nuclear weapon against NATO and compels the United States to consider, are we willing to exchange the city of Boston for the city of Poznan? That's a Polish city that under the Karaganov theorem would be struck preemptively with a Russian nuclear weapon, sending a signal to NATO that we're done playing games. The question now is, what would an American president do when that happens? Would the American president be willing now to commit to defend Poznan, defend Poland, defend NATO with an American nuclear response, knowing that it would cost American cities? And that's a fair question. And the fact that the Russians are considering this, are bantering this about at the highest levels, means that we are losing control of the nuclear genie. Roger Waters wrote a song, Two Suns in the Sunset. And there's a chorus in there, the rusty wire that holds the cork that keeps the anger in gives way, and suddenly it's day again. That rusty wire is real. That was the arms control framework that people like myself and others put in place with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. That's gone. The rusty wire is about to give way, and it's over, ladies and gentlemen, over. And it's happening now in front of us as we speak. We have a president who when he was a senator in the Senate, was never right on any national security issue. Just ask, Robert Gates, former defense secretary, says Biden was wrong on everything. Well, he's now the commander in chief, and once again, he's wrong on everything. He's surrounded himself with people who are likewise wrong on everything, who have imbued themselves with this dangerous fantasy that America can impose its will, and we are compelling Europe to commit suicide in Ukraine, and in doing so, making possible the notion of a Russian preemptive nuclear strike against a NATO ally that could bring the United States in. This is real. I agree with President Biden at this point in time. This is as real as it gets, and it's happening right now in front of us, and we're sleepwalking through this. We, the collective West, don't understand what's happening. And by the time the lights go off, it's going to be too late, because the lights going off are going to be the thermonuclear warheads landing in the vicinity of your neighborhood, and you'll have about a millisecond to reflect on, oh, damn, we were foolish, before you're evaporated. This is as real as it gets.
And that Roger Waters song you're talking about, when he refers to the daylight, he's not talking about a sunrise. He's talking about nuclear fallout. He's talking about the total destruction. And we could absolutely potentially see that. And I think a lot of people have to ask the question, if we're so concerned, if we've been so concerned about Ukraine's safety and security and democracy, and there's all this talk and bluster about them joining the EU, why are they not in NATO?
Because that would automatically trigger a nuclear conflict. Plus, we never want them in NATO. We don't want them in the European Union. We don't want Ukraine to be anything other than a nation that provides us with unlimited supply of fresh meat to throw into the meat grinder against Russia, in the hopes that we can hurt Russia more than, not they hurt Ukraine, because we don't care about Ukraine. I hope people wake up to understand the following too. All those people that are out there putting the Ukrainian flags on their social media, putting them out in front of their house, this virtue signaling that I'm for Ukraine, all you're doing is condemning Ukrainian men to death. This counteroffensive has failed because it was always doomed to fail. It was never going to succeed. And the irony is, we knew that. We knew that when we trained them. Any military professional will tell you straight up, you can't take people and put them and try to train them on complex technology in a very limited period of time. So all they know how to do is turn it on, turn left, turn right, rotate the turret, load, and then say, oh, you're ready to go to war. War is people who have a sixth sense about their equipment. As they go in, they can listen to the engine, understand that they can get a little bit more out of it, a little bit less. They know how to pause. They know how to pivot, roll, move, shoot, pull back. It's an intimacy that you develop with your equipment over years of experience, not 5 weeks, not 5 days. And then we turn around and we employ them in a combat, the most complicated military mission imaginable, which is an assault, a breaching assault of a fortified defensive position. It is the hardest thing to do in the military. It's the most bloody thing to do. It will only work if everything goes right, and nothing was going to go right ever, because one of the prerequisites of a breaching assault is the first phase, which is suppression. That as you are going through the minefields and the obstacle belts, approaching the defensive line, you need to suppress in totality the enemy's ability to interdict your movement to the target. That means you need an air force that is capable of clearing the skies of the enemy air force. You need artillery that suppresses enemy artillery. You need fire support that knocks out the local defenses so that your troops can work their way through the minefield. The Ukrainians don't have an air force, which means Russia controls the airways. The Russian Air Force, Russian helicopters are slaughtering the Ukrainians before they even get to the defensive belt. Then they get mired down in the minefields, and the Russian artillery comes on and does the rest. We're jamming their communications. The Russians are jamming their communications, doing it. And the end result is these Ukrainians haven't even reached the initial defensive line. An assault against a breaching assault against a defensive position is only a success when you clear the final defensive line on the opposite side of the defensive line of all enemy forces. Now you have breached the lines. There's 3 defensive belts that the Russians have. Ukrainians haven't even reached the first one. and they can't succeed until they breach all three. They're never going to do it, and we knew it from the start. We literally train these people to die, and that's what's happening, and that's why Putin accurately notes that this counteroffensive is over.
That's unbelievable. So they haven't even reached the first defensive belt. And so for all of the bluster and hearing these reports in the Western media that the counteroffensive is sluggish, it's not going as well as they'd like, is really a total lie and a fantasy, that it's not doing anything at all other than consuming Ukrainian lives and throwing these men into the meat grinder. So when Putin says yesterday that this is ground to a halt, he says, I see calm, there's really nothing going on. What does this mean then for any sort of offensive left? You've said this thing has been over. It's all that's left is the fighting. It's like the picking up of scraps at this point. So what will happen as the U.S. and EU continues to funnel weapons into this mess?
Well, the sad thing is that this offensive has no legitimate military objective because you can't achieve it. I mean, that's like me creating the Scott Ritter Space Agency and saying that it is my objective to be on Mars in a year and a half. And people say, well, that ain't never going to happen because you don't have the budget, you don't have the technology, you don't have the infrastructure, you got nothing but an idea. For the Ukrainians to say that they want to punch through the Russian defensives, get to the Sea of Azov, cut off Crimea, cut off the land bridge connecting Crimea to Russia, threaten Crimea and get the Russians to surrender is like me saying I'm going to be on Mars in a year and a half. It just isn't going to happen. It's incapable of happening. What the Ukrainians have to do, however, is create the perception that they can continue to pose a viable military threat to Russia worthy of the NATO investment in them. Now, what's happened so far with this counteroffensive is the exact opposite. What they're demonstrating is the truth, that no matter what NATO does, Ukraine will never be able to defeat Russia. Moreover, Russia will eventually strategically defeat Ukraine, regardless of the NATO assistance. And so Zelensky can't afford to have NATO roll into its summit on July 11th with this perception. So he is going to be compelled to continue to throw troops, double down on stupid, continue to throw troops into the breach because he has to show something on July 11th. But what he's going to show is the total destruction of the 60,000 strong Ukrainian force that NATO has been building since October of last year. It's going to be eliminated. And then the question confronting NATO is, do we do this again? And now here's the issue, because we now know that Leopard tanks aren't magic. They burn. They burn very well. We know that Bradley infantry fighting vehicles aren't magic. They burn. We know that the Storm Shadow is not a magic weapon. It gets shot down. And so now the question is, if they say, hey, we're going to continue to support, you can't use the same formula that has already failed. So the next wave of support will include F-16 fighters, ATACMS long-range missiles. You see, now we're escalating the issue further. And then when that fails, because it will fail, what's next after that? And we get into the ridiculousness where we have a former Secretary General of NATO, Rasmussen, talking about creating a coalition of the willing, that is NATO members operating not as NATO, but their own distinct coalition to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. So now we have that escalation. What happens when they get annihilated and you have the imagery of 10,000 Polish troops being marched into a Russian prisoner of war camp? Does Germany come in? And then if the Germany comes in, are they going to do it by themselves? Or are they going to articulate for an Article 4 covered by NATO? And now we have NATO-Russian involvement in Ukraine, and there we are, one step away from the world ending. This is the stupidity of this escalation. People need to stop this nonsense. NATO will never beat Russia. NATO will never beat Russia. That will never happen. The United States will never beat Russia. We don't have the military capacity to defeat Russia in a large-scale ground conflict in Europe. That is a statement of fact. We could put everything America has in Europe today, and the Russians will beat us because we're not that good anymore. Now, we could spend trillions of dollars to rebuild the American conventional warfighting capability, but that's going to take years. The army we have right now cannot fight the Russians. It's physically unable to fight the Russians. As General Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe and the Supreme Allied Commander, noted, last January in a presentation he made to a Swedish Defense Forum. The scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and the Russians is beyond the imagination of NATO. Listen to what I just said, beyond the imagination. Now, if you're a military planner, that means you haven't imagined this, so everything you're planning for doesn't take into account reality. You don't have the firepower necessary. You don't have the force structure necessary. You don't have the tactics. You don't have the equipment. You don't have anything necessary to fight that conflict. And that's the state of play with NATO forces today. They spent the last 20 years preparing to do nation building in Afghanistan, low intensity conflict around the world, limited military peacekeeping missions in Europe. The last thing NATO has been preparing to do is put 120,000 men across the border to carry out large-scale ground combat against a peer-level force who is combat hardened and has been doing this for 15 months, is more prepared than they are. NATO can't do this, and yet van der Leyen, Stoltenberg, and others continue to pretend as if NATO has this capacity. They don't. NATO is bankrupt. They're bankrupt in terms of their training, their capacity. They've given all their weapons away to Ukraine. That's been burned up. They don't have the ability to build new weapons. Germany has just come out and they're sort of admitting that all this talk about spending 100 billion euros to rebuild the German army is just talk, because no matter what Rheinmetall wants to do, they can't afford the steel. Nobody can make the steel because of high energy costs. The raw materials necessary to build this military either can't be procured or are too expensive to be procured. And that's all of Europe is in that situation. So this notion of a rebuilt NATO army, et cetera, or in America, find a defense contractor right now that's prepared to do the short-term contracting necessary to produce the weapons that Ukraine needs. They won't. Why? Because their job isn't to create an American or a global defense capable of standing up to Russians. Their job is to make money. Their job is contracting. So they say, if you want us to do this, we need long-term contracts. So we produce enough equipment so that the profit margin is sufficient to make our investors and our board members happy. Russia doesn't have that problem. When Putin and the Russian leadership say, we need you to do X, Y, and Z, the Russian defense industry says, yep, we're doing it, because they work for the state. They actually care about the defense of the state. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon don't give a rat's ass, excuse my language, about the defense of America. They only care about the bottom line. And right now, they are saying, we're not going to do the short-term contracting that you want us to do to meet the supply requirements for Ukraine. We need longer-term contracts, but that's very expensive. And now we run into budget issues because Congress has to weigh in on that. And now we get a debate within Congress about whether or not this is the right thing to do.
What an absolute mess. Incredibly sobering. And yeah, high energy costs in Germany. Maybe you could have called your friends who blew up your Nord Stream pipeline and had a discussion about that before that happened on top of it. I hope that people pay attention to what you just said. Really, really sobering and eye-opening, and I hope people pay attention to it. Scott Ritter, great to see you as always. Thank you so much for this. I encourage people to go and read Scott's newest piece in Consortium News on this nuclear escalation. And we are slow walking right there. Scott, thank you so much for this. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.